So far, we have symbolized compound statements involving only two simple statements and one connection between them. We're going to eventually need to symbolize and create truth tables for more complex statements. How do we go about that? How do we go about parsing a more complex statement? That is, reading a more complex statement in such a way that we can convert it into symbols. Well, we start by reading the statement. If I go to class and do not fall asleep, then I will play video games later. Now that we've read through the full statement, our next step is to identify the simple statements, that is, the parts of this statement that are themselves statements. And it looks like we have this I go to class part. We have this I do not fall asleep part. We'll have to mess around with that. And this I will play video games part. Okay. It looks like those parts are going to give us our simple statements. The first one, I go to class, that's a simple statement as written. Maybe we'll call that statement P. The next one, I do not fall asleep. That's not a simple statement. That is a negative statement. And when we make simple statements, we want them to be positive. So instead of I do not fall asleep, we'll say our next simple statement is I do fall asleep, or just I fall asleep. We'll call that statement Q. And again, there's no not, because simple statements should be positive. And then this third, I will play video games. We could just say I will play video games. Sometimes life is simpler if we just put everything in the present tense. I play video games. And we've used P and Q. This third simple statement can be R. Okay. The next thing we want to do is identify the main connection in the sentence. How do we divide our sentence up into two main parts? I see that we have two different conjunctions. We have an and a then. Which one is the main connector? Well, looking here, I see if, then. If, then go together, right? And the and is between the if and the then. If we have an if-then, everything between if and then will always be the if part. So if what's between if and then has connectors in it, that connector is not the main connector. So in this case, if-then is our main connector. We'll symbolize that. So we'll have something before and something after. We don't know what they are yet. So we identify our main connector first and just kind of sketch out symbolizing that. Next, we look at the parts. Before the main connector, so the if part of the if-then, I have I go to class and I didn't say I, but that's the subject of this second clause. Do not fall asleep. So this is an and statement, right? I've got an and. Before the and, I have I go to class, that's P. And after the and, I have I do not fall asleep, that's not Q. So we symbolize that as P and not Q. What do we have after the main connector? So after the then, we have I will play video games later. Now the will and the later don't do anything in the logic. They just tell us about time, which we're not interested in. I play video games. That's just are. So that second clause gets symbolized as just are. So we have our kind of skeleton of our statement from our main connector. We plug in P and not Q before the if-then, and we plug in just are afterward. P and not Q does need those parentheses because there's something happening there. R is just by itself, so we don't end up needing parentheses around R. We will see more examples of this, but let's just go through and identify what the steps were that we followed. First, we identified the simple statements. Remember that simple statements should be positive. If we have negative simple statements, we'll use negation later. Second, we identify and symbolize the main connector. This will split the original sentence into two smaller parts. Then we look at those parts and symbolize them as their own statements. If we have more complicated statements, we might need to go back to step 2, identify a main connector within the smaller statement, and then symbolize those parts as their own statements. So we might need to loop through steps 2 and 3 several times if we have very, very complicated statements.